Welcome to this week's 3 minute takeaway. I think I forgot to do it last week, and I apologize. I got busy with some other things, but I'm trying to be more persistent and consistent in doing this. But anyway, I wanted to talk a little bit about what we spent some time with in our lesson last week. And we've been spending some time this month at Kimberly looking at lessons from the birth of Jesus. And it seems like an appropriate time to do that, considering the season and how so many in the world around us look at this time of year as a celebration of Jesus' birth. It's an observance that originated with man and not God. And so often we in the churches of Christ tend to avoid that part of the gospel completely. And certainly in December, for fear that we might be seen as promoting Christmas as a religious observance and as a part of the church's mission. And while it's true that Jesus' birth isn't the most important thing about the gospel story, it's also true that it's a story rich in meaning. When we look at how the story sets the stage for Jesus' ministry, for his kingdom, and for anyone who desires to seek Jesus in faith, there's a lot we can learn from these chapters. And it provides us an opportunity, I think, during this time of the year, when everyone's thinking about Jesus' birth, to take that as a starting point to direct people's minds to why that birth mattered to begin with, and why God calls us to go far beyond simply observing a special day each year. So, this past Sunday, we talked about the birth of Christ and how it reflected and pointed towards Jesus as not just a king, but as the king, the promised Messiah, the anointed of God. And it pointed towards the kingdom that he came to establish. And we spent some time talking about how, from the very beginning, Jesus, the true king, was resisted by the rulers of man, specifically in Matthew 2 by Herod, who was at that time the king over Judea. And as many of you know, there's a lot of irony in Herod sitting on the throne when Jesus was born, because Herod was probably the last person at that time that should have been occupying that seat. He was an Edomite by descent. And if you remember your Old Testament stories, that means he was a descendant from Esau, the brother of Jacob, the one who didn't receive the blessing from Isaac. Do you remember that? The man from whom one of Israel's greatest enemies came. This was where the Edomites, which were continually battling with Israel throughout their history, Esau was where that came from. And that's who Herod was. Herod was not only a Jew by religion, but certainly not one in his heart. Like God's great King David, he took it upon himself to build a temple to God, but in Herod's case, it meant leveling and rebuilding the existing temple and building one that was magnificent and renowned throughout the area. But he did it not to glorify God as David did, but he did it instead to appease the Jewish community and to secure his own power in the region. He was appointed by the Romans as king, so he had no claim by birth or divine right to the throne. And so when Jesus arrives with a claim to the kingdom, Herod tries to have him killed. Even in his old age, close to death. Herod probably died that year or shortly thereafter. But even then, he refused to accept that anyone else would ever sit on what he considered to be his throne by right. So here's a twist to the story. Have you ever considered that Herod might also be symbolic to some degree of you and me? We like to think of ourselves as Herod, as wicked and murderous as he was. He was a horrible human being. But when we see a man who desired to rule, he refused to submit to the rightful king, and he was willing to do anything in his power to maintain his place. Does that sound, in some ways, like how we often approach Jesus as king? Jesus is reigning today on his throne over an eternal kingdom. That's the purpose for which he was born. And Ephesians 1:20-21 tell us that much. It says that God raised him from the dead, seated him at his right hand in the heavenly places, far above all rule and authority and power and dominion, above every name that is named, not only in this age, but also in the one to come. And unlike Herod, Jesus has an offer to raise us up as well. Ephesians 2 says that God has raised us up in Christ and seated us with him in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus. So how do we respond in the face of our King as we see Jesus ruling? Do we push back at every opportunity? Do we refuse to give up control over our lives, insisting on going our own way, or picking and choosing the parts of God's will that we'll obey because we want our own desires and impulses to rule over at least some of our lives? We don't want to give up control of our throne. Or do we bow before Jesus, giving our full selves as living sacrifices, Romans 12:1 teaches, submitting our will before the rightful king over our lives? Something to think about this week. We're going to be continuing the theme next week and talk about Jesus' birth story as relates to his divine nature. Can Jesus be the Son of God if the birth story didn't happen? We're going to spend some time on that. Hopefully you'll join us this Sunday. But thank you for joining us today. Lord willing, we'll see you next week with another 3-minute takeaway.